I met Thurston first in March 1985 on the Bad Moon Rising tour. Sonic Youth came over to England, I think, for the first time, and I think I went over to Leeds to see them play. It was their third gig, I think, in the UK. Now, true to the cliche, there were less than 24 people there. I was like a fanzine editor, and I interviewed Sonic Youth before the gig. And I did the interview at Pizza Hut in Leeds, which, even at the time, I thought was a little bit incongruous, interviewing one of the great underground New York rock bands in Pizza Hut. But there was no choice, really, in Leeds at that time. The following year, 1986, I graduated to writing for the NME, and I badgered the editor to give me at least half a page to wax lyrical about Evil, which, when it came out, totally overwhelmed me. I just thought it was just one of the best pieces of music, one of the greatest albums. And I kind of began to put Sonic Youth there with probably my favourite band of all time, Joy Division. And I think when I heard Evil, that was suddenly, I was, like I say, overwhelmed by it. The same year, I was lucky enough to promote their show at the Boardwalk in Manchester. I was looking at the paperwork. They were paid £350. And the Membranes played for free. So thank you, Brother John Robb, for that. 1987, they came back, the sister tour, and again I promoted them. I put them on at the Ardrey Ballroom in Manchester, an Irish club. Mike Watts' band Firehose supported the band. I paid them £1,050, but to save money, they came back to my flat and stayed over. They didn't want to stay in a hotel, so they came back to my rather grotty flat in Hume, which was amazing. So I had like my favourite rock band in the whole world staying over, and I was like 25, and I was sitting up all night talking to Lee Ronaldo about modern American novels and saying to Thurston and Kim, help yourself to the red stripe in the fridge, whatever. So I've carried those moments, as you can tell, in my heart and in my soul and in my memory bank ever since then as kind of 5 of the probably top 10 moments of my life. Anyway, I met Thurston 10 minutes ago and he didn't remember any of them. Okay? He didn't recall Leeds, Pizza Hut. He didn't recall the Boardwalk, the Ardrey Ballroom, any of that, the cans of Red Stripe. So we are now reacquainted, stroke acquainted. Obviously, having not continued our interview since 1985, there's a few things to talk about. I've kind of got a strategy. I'm kind of hoping that we can talk a little bit about those early years and your first trip to Europe, etc. And then maybe jump forward, talk about the early Geffen years, and then jump forward again and, of course, talk about your activities now and the band, the new band. But before then, can I kind of start by I'm a bit uncomfortable asking you, but I'm going to. Ask you about the breakup with Kim and wow. That signal. And...
Taxi.
And... I mean, does that signal the end of Sonic Youth?
Sonic Youth is on hiatus. That's all that's going on right now. Mm-hmm. I mean the band is very much a democracy of sorts, and as long as Kim and I are sort of working out our situation, the band can't really function reasonably. So that's basically what it is in a nutshell. So, I was always really impressed when I would see bands as bands that the bands could not break up unless somebody in the band disappeared or died or exploded. Like Spinal Tap, where the drummer would explode. I always thought that was kind of great. It was like, oh, you need a new drummer because your drummer exploded. And there was a band in New York City in the 70s that I really liked called the Dead Boys. And they used to say in interviews, like, the Dead Boys can't break up unless somebody dies. And the only way to leave this band is if you die. And I thought that was like kind of a great, idea about being in a band. I always thought of bands as gangs. and I like that idea of this kind of gang of artists. And so Sonic Youth is definitely that. And we always throughout our entire career, for lack of a better word, all of the compositions of Sonic Youth have been always under the name Sonic Youth, regardless of whoever's bringing the music in or whoever's bringing the lyrics in. We all share that work equally because the band is a forum for all of us to work within.
And were you kind of taken aback or kind of angered by the fact that what was kind of a really, in a way, private matter kind of ended up being, I mean, the internet doesn't help, obviously, but being kind of somehow public property and people feeling...
Well, we're somewhat... We're public figures. I mean, I don't think of Sonic Youth as some kind of famous band. I never really did. I mean, it always surprises me when I'm in situations like this, and there's this kind of adulatory kind of thing, which I love. I mean, it's great. It's very, very flattering. But I never really think of us in the pantheon of fame so much. I mean, I always see us as a very sort of marginalized kind of a band that's more like an underpinning to things that happen more successfully in the mainstream. But but I do get it, because I mean the bands that I admire are the bands that I wanted to be like in Sonic Youth. But no, I don't really. I mean, to me, it's like I respect the opinions of in my personal life of people who are friends and family and intimates, and so I understand that like any kind of commentary outside of that, it really has no meaning for me. Mm-hmm. It just does not, and it's sort of like me commenting on your personal life. It wouldn't make any sense, and so it doesn't make any sense to me. It's disturbing, but it doesn't make any sense to me. And so I basically sort of turn a blind eye to it, and I stay away from it because it really has no. It doesn't have any really basis in the reality of the actual situation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's probably that fan performer thing where people kind of invest emotion and idealize, even if you're not a big band,
Yeah.
In a way, probably even more if you're not a big band. The fact that people have a very personal or had a very personal connection with Sonic Youth. You think that's kind of one of the things.
I respect. I completely respect all the honor and love that people have towards the music that Sonic Youth has put out there, and I understand that there can be anger because all of a sudden it's gone because of a situation that happened within the personal dynamic of the band, and but that's just the way it is, And it's like we're real people living in the real world, and this is not too. I don't think it's too uncommon a situation in the real world, but sometimes people look at bands as superheroes. I certainly do, I mean, you mentioned a band like Joy Division earlier. To me, they're mythic to me. But if you look at the personal histories of the gentlemen in Joy Division, it's rife with problems. We all live in a life where personal problems define us, and it's part of living. It's part of growing up, and I don't know anybody who lives a charmed and blessed life of indifference and not having to deal with any kind of like personal issues that can be problematic. But when it is in the public, I mean, I feel sorry for like super celebrities whose lives are magnified on the cover of scandal magazines and things like that. I can't even imagine what that's like. I mean, so thank God it's not anything like that.
So looking back then over those, I mean, I think it's 16 albums and numerous collections, etc. What for you were the best times for Sonic Youth, when you really kind of felt that you were doing exactly what you wanted and were being received, etc., and it was working?
I think when we first came over to the UK and into Europe, nobody really knew who we were so much, and we just had one record out and another record coming out, and we played in mostly kind of like squat clubs and punk clubs across Europe, and we were sort of we were sort of entering into this world of where anything could happen in punk rock, because anything could happen, and we started connecting with other individuals who were wanting to sort of do musical expression outside of the tradition that even punk rock sort of was part of, which was kind of this, we always thought like, well, the Sex Pistols were really pretty radical, but they're still playing just sort of a rougher sort of Chuck Berry chord progression thing. So we were kind of more interested in things we were hearing coming out of bands like like Wire and the pop group, and even the Slits, which the Slits did this incredible record, their album Cut, which was like, to us, was like this incredibly great experimental record. And then concurrently there was a band called the Raincoats from London that we really liked, and that was kind of who we saw as our our contemporaries. And so traveling across Europe, we would meet people like Nine Stairs into Neubauten, who were just sort of beginning in Berlin, and that was really fantastic for us to see other bands like this. I think coming back to New York after that trip, which must have been I think in 1983, when we were first over here, and then playing at CBGB, and we had played CBGB a few times, and it was mostly sort of these audition nights when you were just in this kind of cattle call of bands. And we came back and we played, and in the Village Voice, and said, back from Europe tour Sonic Youth, which was pretty glamorous to begin with, and everybody showed up. People that we kind of knew on the scene at that time, and who were in bands, and be it like the beginnings of bands like Swans and these other bands like that. Their names wouldn't mean anything, but they all showed up and they were there, and all of a sudden we were kind of like being regarded as like a serious kind of working band, and, doing music that was just kind of really kind of out of the ordinary.
So so then you had already got the ambition to be more than kind of like a local band. I guess the bands that you didn't mention were probably the bands that ended up being...
Our ambitions were day to day. At that age, in your 20s, your ambitions don't really go beyond like the weekend, when we first came back to the UK, it was sort of on the invite of Paul Smith, who came out of Nottingham, and he was working in the offices of Mute Records, and he had a label called Double Vision, and he was doing different productions. He was, the early Cabaret Voltaire stuff he was doing, and he had heard about us through Lydia Lunch, who was living in London at the time, and Lydia was really celebrated in London. She was associated with like all the most kind of incredible personalities at that time, like the Birthday Party, who were living there, and she told Paul Smith about us, and told some other people too, and he was the only one who was interested, and he tried to find us in the States. He was writing letters and calling telephones that he had gotten numbers from, and which was the only way of communication. But I picked up the phone and talked to him, and he said he wanted to put out a record by us, and I said okay, and I just sent him a tape of what we had just done, which was this record Bad Moon Rising, which I think you mentioned. And so we came over on his invite, and he put us up, and we slept on floors such as yours, and that was how it was more of an economical decision as opposed to an aesthetic decision. But it was and he had us play every little club he could find, and he was really smart about sort of doing things that would sort of draw attention towards the band. He had us play at the ICA in London, which was a big coming out show for us. And I remember that show and being completely unnerved by it, because to be playing in London in a show where all the spotlight was on you, and to me London was really magical. I used to have these fantasies in the 70s about leaving New York and coming to London and hanging out with Public Image and sort of like doing records with these guys. But I had no impression of what London was like, and my first impression previous to that was really a disaster because we had no money and we got into town and we were playing at a venue that was called The Venue, and we were opening up for this band SPK, who were from Australia. They were a surgical penis clinic, and I really liked SPK. They had come to New York and played CBGBs, and they showed sort of vivisection films from hospitals, and they played like really harsh industrial noise on stage, smashing metal. And I'm just like, oh, these guys are fantastic, and so I was really excited to play with SBK, but the word was that SBK had sort of foregone all of this horror and became somewhat of a dance act. And sure enough, SBK was doing sort of dance music on stage, and it was it kind of left the audience cold. But we were supposed to go on right before them, but there was another performer named Danielle Dax, and she argued that she should go on before them and we should go on before her. And so we had a big to-do about this, and we're like, well, you live here. I mean, you can go on, you can play anytime here. And she goes, well, you lot went abroad, and so I'll never be able to do that. And anyway, she won, and we went on first to like a very tiny part of the audience that was hardly there yet. And we played for about 15 minutes, and at that point we were really savage, and we were just sort of sticking things in the guitars and smashing them and playing semblances of these songs we had, and just bashing out the amps all the way up. And Lee's amp actually blew up on stage, and smoke was coming out of it. And after 15 minutes, the curtains started closing, and so I started like bashing the curtains with my guitars and just like trying to tear the curtain down. And there was two young boys who were just leaning against the stage and just staring at us wide-eyed and just like pointing and going like, brilliant. And I always wondered where these two boys were. Like, whatever happened to these guys? Because they were the first two fans in the UK, as far as I was concerned. They got it. And so subsequently, we left with our tails between our legs, and we had no money, and we went to Victoria Station, and we slept on benches, and then we kind of made our way to Heathrow, and we kind of crawled home. And it was brutal. And then there was a review of the show in the NME, which was fantastic to get actually written about, and and the NME was just like incredible. And there was a review, and it disparaged Danielle Dax and SBK, and it said Sonic Youth were the best thing on 8 legs tonight. It was we got all the press, and we were just like, oh, this is we made an impression upon it. We were critics' darlings right away.
I like the fact that you were in New York, kind of dreaming of this mythical coming over to London, and everyone who was living in England at the time was dreaming of this mythical New York and wanting to go over there.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting that a lot of your, because again, in the kind of received version of Sonic Youth is that you're kind of like a New York band, and that you're talking about Wire, pop group Slits, and the Raincoats. So your influences were from.
Well, that era of music from the UK was really profound for us. It was really potent, and we knew that what we had going on in New York, we had this great music that was happening there, as like with the no wave bands of Contortions and DNA and Mars and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, which was Lydia Lunch's outfit. And we knew those bands were great as well, and we knew that we had great bands coming that. I mean, of course, like the Talking Heads and Television. And Richard Hell and the Voidoids were fabulous. But like any scene, I mean, there was like, those are like, I just named like 4 or 5 bands. There was like 40 or 50 bands that were just really horrible, that were always playing. So you sort of had there was these nuggets within the field of crud.
And, I was looking back at that interview from 1985 when I was an earnest young fanzine editor, and we talked a lot about the need for alternative culture, and we talked about how the 60s had happened and there was the underground there, and then punk had happened, and that it was, and we were talking about how it was our generation's turn to kind of create an alternative, or at least to kind of nurture an alternative, to think in alternative ways. I guess it was like Reagan and Thatcher and so on, and the alternative music meant alternative culture. And I kind of wondered how, looking back, whether you kind of recognised that you had those sort of serious intentions back then.
I don't think there was any intention of responsibility at that point, as far as like wanting to sort of be expansive with counterculture for the sake of expressing something that felt more experimental or experiential to what was going on in the mainstream, which was fairly commodified for a certain demographic. I think basically what it was is really wanting to be part of a lineage of subversion, in the culture, because it's like I always felt like it's in the subversive where you sort of can sort of kind of glean ideas towards like new expression, and that to me was obvious really early on. I think just sort of looking in culture magazines, rock and roll magazines, I was always, you would always, what was resonant to me was like people who were doing things that were not for any ambition towards acceptance in the culture, but to actually sort of shock the culture. And so early on in the early 70s, when I was a young guy, I would see, when I first saw images of like Iggy and the Stooges, and there's a picture of like a singer in the audience on top of the people's hands, spray painted silver. I was like, who's that? Like, what is that? I'm not interested in so much in this kind of Rick Wakeman character with a flowing cape behind a bank of synthesizers, which is, I was kind of I saw, the first concert I saw was Rick Wakeman's Journey to the Center of the Earth, by the way. I admit but that was just happenstance. I kind of really wanted to see Alice Cooper, but nobody would take me. And so that everybody was interested in going to see bands like America or Beatlemania on Broadway or something, and I,
do you think that music still has that subversive power at all?
Completely, yeah.
And in what ways?
I think because I think it has the power to bring people together in like an excited state. I think it still does, and regardless of what's going on in the technology or however in the production of the music, which are ideas I think that are sort of talked about at length at events like this about the technology of music production, and to me it's just like that's the least of my concerns. I mean, I'm really into the archaic in a way of doing things that have sort of vibrational quality. So therefore, it has to be physical and tactile, and that's not something I'm willing to leave behind. So I don't really see it as quaint. I see sort of making vinyl records and making cassette tapes, analog tapes, and working with analog sound, or doing production with books of paper and other materials. I don't see that as nostalgic or old-fashioned or quaint. I see that as everlasting, as part of like this kind of human condition of touch and feel and vibration. So I don't really spend too much of time with sort of digital media, even though I do utilize it as a recording artist. I have to, as far as like exchanging files and such. But it's only for the sake of function. It's not for the sake of enjoyment. Of like like Neil Young was always talking about, like he does like his new digital recorder. What's it called? Pono, and which I think is kind of it's wonderful that he's so invested in that. But he's the first one when digital music was really becoming prevalent to say that it's like the big difference is the human ear hears something different each time it hears an analog recording played again and again, because it's not numbers, it's not mathematical numbers that the ear and the brain processes and then doesn't have to process again because it's already processed everything that it needs to know. Whereas analog is more of a wave, and so it doesn't. It's not defined completely each time. So it's like that's why you would, as a child, listening to a record over and over again, it's comforting and somewhat sensuous because it's you know what it is, but it's always something new about it. You know, so it's like, you know, like when I touch you, and I touch you again. The second time was the same, but
equally good.
But equally good. Yeah. But better.
But better. We're not just the two tallest men in the room. There's something else. You mentioned Neil Young. There's and just taking us on to the kind of the Geffen years. And there was this,
I never think of my
my
timeline of working in music. I never think of those years as the Geffen years. But go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of interested, obviously, because I think that, you know, at that point, you know, signed to a major label, and the kind of, I'm interested in the kind of culture clashes that went on, because I know that you were invited to support Neil Young and went on a tour, and at that point you found that the Neil Young's audience were kind of very unreceptive, borderline hostile.
Yeah, Neil Young's
audience. I kind of wondered, I wondered if how much of that kind of culture clash did you experience in that era, you know, in terms of maybe with the record company and in terms of trying to, in terms of being playing to new audiences or being exposed to a different situation than you've been exposed to.
I think there were certain young people who were entering into the workforce of major labels at that time in the late 80s, who were coming out of universities and who were pretty much very close to the experience of 77 onwards punk rock and post-punk and new wave music throughout the 80s. That was their music, and these are people who came out of business schools and just sort of, you know, ideas of wanting to sort of be in part of the music business and the music industry, and getting work within the major labels, the corporations, and which were thriving to some degree. And I think those were the people who were responsible for bringing bands like us into their world, because we had no real, we never fooled ourselves into thinking like that's where we should be. But at the same token, we were also kind of a little frustrated by our situation in the independent music world, because we kept moving laterally, and a lot of the work that was being done with independent labels was being done by people like us who didn't really know how to play their guitars. And so not knowing how to play my guitar was something I could sort of utilize to some success in songwriting, but not knowing how to run a record label and running a record label was a bit difficult, I thought. And so we were working with record labels that just, I mean, they loved what they were doing, they loved music, but they didn't know how to sort of deal with accounting. Let's put it that way. There's, you know, accounting when it starts coming to sort of dealing with accounting and money between two factors, it becomes very problematic. And I sort of recognized that at some point where that was getting worse and worse as the 80s came along. I mean, went along, and I think some people were very successful in that. I mean, certainly, I think more so in the UK when you sort of had the cartel at Rough Trade, and you know they were very serious about how we can sort of keep these relationships strong and ethical. But for the most part, it was kind of it was a bit of a question mark about where money was going, where money was coming from, and et cetera. And nobody knew how to sort of read this. And I certainly didn't come out of business school. And the idea of that a major label would want to sort of entertain the notion of signing a band like Sonic Youth came because these new young people were in the company, and they were being instructed to find the next whatever. And so they weren't really interested in finding so much the next Aerosmith or the next Kiss or the next Led Zeppelin, because they knew that's not what they were interested in. They were kind of interested in finding bands that sort of were doing music that was like what they loved, which was Gang of Four or things like this.
But did it change the way? I mean, did it change the way that you made music? Obviously, suddenly you were able to, work in better equipped studios, and you had, the budget wasn't so limited. So how did it change?
I used to always think during the 80s, like the kind of music we made, like imagine what it would sound like if we had like a 48-track board and we had like the production facility of an Aerosmith record. Like what would this music sound like? What would like Confusion is Sex or Sister or Evil, what would that sound like if we really worked with like, an incredible production system instead of like, two 8-tracks gang together and all of us producing, and that finally sort of happened when we signed to Geffen. We did this record, Goo, and we kind of were put in this position. And at that point, it seemed to sort of belie it in a way, and it's like it just sort of seemed to add an unnecessary kind of patina of professionalism as far as recording goes to it, and it didn't really. I don't think
so. It wasn't the step change that you thought it would be then.
I don't think so, but when we signed to Geffen, it was just sort of it was basically because we knew in the USA we could get health insurance, and so in the USA you need health insurance, otherwise you can't go to a hospital, you can't use a doctor because it costs too much money, and so you die. So you need to have insurance to pay for it. And that's basically why so we could have health insurance, so we could have clear accounting, and we don't have to work at dishwashing jobs anymore. And that was the real reason that we signed to Geffen. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't because we wanted to sort of compete with like any other major label bands at all. It wasn't that at all. And so the first record we made for Geffen Records, we had already been sort of constructing even before we signed to them. But it did allow us to sort of prance around with like celebrities once in a while, which was really funny. All of a sudden, we would be with there was these two young men named Nelson who had long white hair. They were like the sons of Ricky Nelson, the pop star, but they were kind of 80s. Do you remember who I'm talking about? No, good. Well, they were there. But it was things like that. But one thing that happened was that we were offered the Neil Young tour of 1990 and the Ragged Glory tour, and we immediately said, well, yeah, we'll do that. And some people sort of advised against it, said, well, you're going to, it's going to be horrible. You're going to be playing arenas and everybody's going to hate you because your music is just not what that kind of audience is going to want to hear. And we said, we don't care. We want to do this 3-month tour with Neil Young. And it's just like, just for the sake of experiencing that, as opposed to going out and trying to promote Sonic Youth to some kind of new listenership. That wasn't really, we didn't fool ourselves into thinking that was what was going to happen. We were going to become huge by opening up for Neil Young. We just knew that it was going to be a really weird, strange trip, and it was. And they tried to get a third band on the bill, and I gave Neil's manager a tape of Bleach by Nirvana that we had a cassette tape of, and that record was just coming out. When the Bleach was out, we had a rough tape of Nevermind that was just before they had made it really Nevermind. The tape was called something else. I still have this cassette tape that Kurt sent me, and I made a copy of it and I gave it to Neil's manager. I said, this band would be really good, and we had already done some gigs with them. I said, and we were thinking, man, that would be so much fun if Nirvana was on the tour. At least we would tour too, because we would, at least we'd have some friends on the tour. And he came back and said, yeah, it was pretty good, but I think we're going to get this other band called Drivin' and Cryin'. I was like, all right, it's too bad.
Talking about.
And I also found out that we weren't Neil's the first choice anyway.
Right.
They said, well, we had a list of bands who we thought we wanted something really radical to fuck with Neil's audience, and Neil really likes to do that, and so you guys were on the list. And I said, well, who else was on the list? And he's like, well, this band called Public Enemy. I was like, wow, that would have been interesting.
Just quickly on that Nirvana, obviously, obviously you being at Geffen was a kind of opened the door to Nirvana ending up being on Geffen, but we won't kind of necessarily go into all that. But when it came to your second Geffen album, Nirvana had hit, I think, if that's
yeah.
And I wondered how did that affect your the way that you approached it? I know you're going to say it didn't affect it at all. Why I'm asking. Approach the next album.
It really helped us. I mean, it brought fortune into our favor. I mean, the first record we did on Geffen didn't really sell that much or anything, and the second record we did, which was Dirty, which is kind of a more sort of focused production as far as a record being on a major label, and they spent an inordinate amount of time and investment in like putting like radio singles out and this and that, thinking like this is the future now. Like Nirvana really struck gold, and so let's like really mess. And that didn't really sell that much either, but it did better. And money was more. There was definitely more sort of re-upping when you would with the label, so there was definitely more capital there. And so, we were able, Kim and I were able to buy a house, outside of New York City and raise our daughter there because of this influx. And I don't think it would have happened without the success of Nirvana's Nevermind record. I mean, that really helped. But it didn't. It's not. But we didn't ever get to the point where we were selling the records like that. Bands like, Stone Temple Pilots or Bush or Red Hot Chili Peppers were selling. I mean, that never happened to us. We never had a gold record. I think the only gold record we ever had was like from the idea that there was some song on a CD on the cover of The Enemy that sort of sold so many copies that we got like this kind of gold record. We got a Canadian gold record.
So why
the ratio's a little different there.
So why did you not sell as many as those other bands?
Oh, why didn't we? I think the music just was. I don't think the music was very. I just don't think it was had any sort of commercial appeal whatsoever. I mean, maybe a little bit. I mean, there was like that song we had on Dirty called "Cool Thing," right? That's right. Yeah. And they tried to really promote that, and they were, there was a video made, and Chuck D was in the video from Public Enemy, and it was just like this big deal, and but a lot of it had to do with just it just things sometimes don't, you can throw them out there, and they don't happen. So it's like, I think it had a lot to do with our own sort of sense of ambition, because that wasn't something that we were striving for, and it was kind of like, well, if it happens, it's great. If not, at least we got we're doing this well. I mean, when we were over here in the UK in the '80s, and Paul Smith had us at Rough Trade, and we were going there all the time and working on like our our future. And he was like, "I want you guys to stay in London, and I think within 5 years, if you stay with me and work with me here at Mute Records, I think you can be as big as the Birthday Party." And to me, for somebody to say like at that time in 1983, 84, that in 5 years you can be as big as the Birthday Party, they might as well have said you will be as big as the Rolling Stones, because the Birthday Party to us were this huge, huge thing. And in retrospect, I think about that, it's fairly comical, to think about that, in thinking about it that way. But that was a magnificent dream to sort of have in my mind, like, oh, in 5 years we're going to be as big as the Birthday Party and like be on the stages like that. And what happened by '92 with the success of Nirvana and everything around them, including us, we were able to actually tour around the world and actually play these incredibly huge audiences that were very welcoming and responsive to what we were doing. It didn't, we always did better in sort of a live situation anyway, because Sonic Youth was really focused on being a live band, and we took that very seriously, and we really got into it to the point where it wasn't purely a theatrical situation. It was all about being in the moment and being really spiritual with the music and understanding the theater of the situation. And I think that's what really worked for us as a band. And so I knew that we had become like a very strong live band. And so that was what I was happy about. And as far as record sales, I kind of understood why a record like Dirty, which Geffen Records would hope to sort of follow the lines of like Nirvana's record, would not do that, because it didn't have that simplicity of pronouncement, and it didn't have the magic that was sort of being coming out of like Kurt's throat, because that was really what it was. Mm-hmm. I mean, if there was any other singer in that band, we wouldn't be talking about them right now. It was complete magic. It was beautiful, and so that everybody recognized it and felt it. So I knew that was the case. I mean, that comes along every great once in a while, so to be part of it and next to it was almost good enough. I would never think like, oh, we got to like pretend that we're that as well. I would never. To pretend would be really fairly dishonorable and gracious to somebody like that.
I did promise that we'd go to the audience, and although we started late, I think we have to finish on time, which is a bit of a shame. Just quickly, though, I saw your solo show, or was billed as a solo show, when you were first recording and gigging as Thurston Moore, when you played the Ritz in Manchester. But now you have a band, so what made you decide to move from being Thurston Moore to being Chelsea Light Moving?
Oh, Chelsea Light Moving we don't exist anymore. That was a project. It was a band, but it was more like a project. It was something I was doing while I was like relocating. I live in London now, and I was like moving from the United States to London. And while I was moving, I was just like I wanted to continue making records, and I was playing with some people in the USA who I've always played with in different capacities, and good friends of mine. And I just started writing really quick songs with them, and I recorded really quickly with them, and they were, and I didn't really want to release it under my own name, because it just felt like I had done a record before that called Demolished Thoughts that I recorded at Beck's in Beck's kitchen, and he produced it, and that was like a solo record. But I didn't feel like this music I was making with these guys was like my next like solo record. So I decided to just give it a band name, and I had Matador put it out, and it was called Chelsea Light Moving, and we kind of toured the USA, and we toured Europe, and I spent a couple of years dealing with it, and now I'm sort of situated in London, and they still live in the USA. So that band is, for all intents and purposes, is kaput, and I've been recording in London actual solo work for a solo record under my own name that will come out in September, and I've been playing with a London guitar player named James Sedwards, who's incredible, and Steve Shelley came over and played drums on most of the material, and Deb Googe from My Bloody Valentine is a bass player, and so it's pretty much done, and so we're going to do some gigs this summer before the record comes out. We'll play some of these park festivals that happen all through England, and me and James and Deb will play, and Steve will play as much as he can with us, because he plays with so many different people, and that's pretty much what the band is right now. I mean, that's, if the band is called anything, it's just my name. Okay. So to me, it's like it has to, right at this point, outside of Sonic Youth, I find that I don't really want to sort of have a band with a band name, because I think in a way it's just sort of it takes me away from Sonic Youth, which I don't want to be taken away from, because it defines me so much, and I'd much rather just sort of do things under my own name and sort of kind of have this Marky Smith kind of dictum. It's like, if it's me and your gran on Triangle, it's the fall. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to quickly open it up to the audience. So do we have the roving mics? Yeah, we'll start on the front row here with the enthusiastic young person.
Hi, my name is Vest, and I'm from Norway. And first I would just like to say that your work in Sonic Youth and with Ecstatic Peace Poetry has meant like a great deal to me. It's been a big inspiration. It enabled me to discover like Michael Gira and Glenn Bracca, and it allowed me to play with Rhys Chatham and his Crimson Grail here in Liverpool in 2012. So I was just wondering, what would be your advice to a young musician who's making experimental music with a political message, kind of spoken word poetry, to get their message out there in like today's kind of overflowing pop digital?
I would just use all your resources to make things. I think making physical objects, like making 7-inches or records or cassettes and books, making them look aesthetically the way you want it to look as a presentation, and trying to disseminate it in any which way you can. I mean, even if you need to go online and create a site and try to bring people to like what you have, try to get people who distribute such things. And there's a lot of distributors who distribute that kind of work that you can actually sort of offer them. It's kind of difficult, but to me, I think you sort of have to make your own club, and like find a place to play, or just play in your flat, and then have people come up and do it, and like maybe put some flyers on telephone poles around town, and or whatever, or just do an invite thing and just try to get people interested in what you're doing, and try to find other people who have similar interests, if possible, but it's not necessary to also do it. There's a lot of power in numbers, as you know. I mean, as far as doing anything that has like sort of political content, that's I think that's probably the most important thing is to try to swell the ranks. But to me, the physicality of the presentation is really important, and not to rely on digital media. I mean, that's there as well, but that can't be primary, because it doesn't have there's you can download words, but you can't download a book. You can download music, but you can't download a record. That's how I think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, the fourth row there. Thank you.
Hi, Thurston. My question is, you speak about how New York was, perhaps central to your success to begin with. And obviously in this country, perhaps London may be an equivalent. My question is it essential to be in these kind of centres of culture and music to break out? No,
especially not now. I was really interested in the early 80s when, in the United States, when there was this whole new scene of punk rock music called hardcore, and around bands like Minor Threat, to some extent Black Flag from Los Angeles, but mostly about bands like Minor Threat from Washington, D.C., and the Necros from like Maumee, Ohio, and there was this whole new network of bands that were sort of decidedly not from the media eye of the cities of New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles, etc. They were all about like not being that, and that was really curious to me, because it created this. It was definitely kind of like taking the cool out of the city. But I think now with interconnectivity so ramped up in our culture that it hardly necessitates to have to live in like a media city. It's only there for your own sort of edification. I like living in a city. I've always been into being in a city. When I think about like having to like move out to any kind of rural area, I get like the horrors, and so I love nature as much as the next guy. But I'll take a city any old time.
Hi, Thurston. My question is, looking back on the whole time of Nirvana and grunge and the success of it, how did that impact Sonic Youth's career? Was it a help or a hindrance when you look back on it?
Yeah, I thought it was, to me, it was just like all of a sudden it was a reclamation of like what was so powerful and fun, and the simplicity of rock and roll and punk rock. it all sort of came out in a way of like in the 80s, like bands sort of breaking the time barrier of 1976, 77, because that was really sacred for a long time. Like anytime you went before 76 or 77, you were entering into this really nefarious territory of hippie music and long hair music. And then all of a sudden, some of the bands in the 80s started referencing what was so majestic about like Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath. And that was really, that didn't really happen for quite a while. So people sort of tiptoed into like into the early 70s and then into the 60s. And that was really fascinating to me. And I think by the time bands like Mudhoney and Nirvana and a lot of the sub pop scene, where they really embraced like that, where it's just like there's no rules anymore as far as like being punk rock, it kind of added like a new, just like a newness to it by actually reinvestigating the old. And so I thought that's what was so beautiful about it, and that there was all of a sudden there was really no rules here anymore. But to me for me it was like Sonic Youth was always very sort of involved with dealing with the more sort of experimental factions of punk rock and rock and roll, and like wanting to listen to music that was like dealing with more avant-garde situations, be it modern composition or avant-garde jazz or whatever, and bringing that into what we were doing. And so when these bands that were sort of half generation to a generation younger us started happening in the late 80s, such as Nirvana and Mudhoney et al., and the kind of music they were playing, which was sort of like this really just getting back into a simplicity of like even like what the Ramones were doing in 76, 77. And the Ramones were very high concept, and they were taking all the last name and wearing leather jackets, and they just sort of had this thing, whereas these guys were not. It was all very sort of like wearing the clothes that they kind of woke up in from the night before, and just sort of plugging in and playing, and just wanting to sort of do that. And there was something very pure and beautiful about it. It really did. It was completely and utterly inspiring. And I thought, and to me, it was all about the songwriting. I just thought the songs were just were so genuine and wonderful and new. And Nirvana was really influenced by bands that were not kind of like hip on the scene. I mean, they really sort of would say like the bands they liked were like REM and Pixies, and then like they would say the B word, which was like the Beatles. And nobody ever mentioned these bands, It was just like you always talked about like, oh yeah, it was like Neubauten and the Birthday Party and Gang of Four and Pop Group and Wire, and these guys were like REM, Pixies, Beatles, but they were like Nirvana would come out and be the most radical band on stage. I mean, they would destroy on all levels. So to me, I really love that kind of. I love their love of like pure pop and rock and roll, and at the same time, complete in danger. It was really great. So yeah, I mean, it was kind of reinformation for me, and to be with that energy, and tour with these bands. I think it brought Sonic Youth more into like kind of a new rock and roll investigation. You can certainly hear it, I think, maybe like on an album like Dirty. And then I think we stepped back after that a little bit and started going a little more internal, because there was a bit of a fallout after Kurt died, and you started getting more into things like what Lou Barlow was doing, or bands like Royal Trucks were doing, and things like this, or even like when Pavement was first sort of coming up, and that was where our interest was, as opposed to all the bands that were sort of kind of ripping off Nirvana and doing like this kind of grunge rock for the mainstream. Like that had absolutely no interest to us, and we walked away from that. And I think Geffen Records probably would have loved us if we had done that, if we became grunge superstars. But instead, we started going inside, and committed career suicide.
I'm getting a couple of signals from the stage manager along the lines that we have only time for a couple more questions, so they better be good. And unfortunately, the answer might have to be a little bit more concise than we'd like. On the aisle there.
Hello, Thurston. I just wanted to ask about sort of where you think things are going in terms of the fragmentation of culture. It seems as if, back in the 70s, everybody would watch Top of the Pops, and if they seen David Bowie with his hand around Mick Ronson, it was a big deal. Whereas now it seems as if everybody has their own sort of clique. I wonder if you think that's a good thing, or whether it's a bad thing that bands like yourselves and Nirvana don't unite, sort of outcasts in a way, and make people feel a bit less alone in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, to talk about like factionalization within the culture is a fairly long conversation to have, I think, at this point. But I do. I don't. To me, it's like change is always change will always be prevalent, and it's like the way things change is it's kind of. I think it's really up to people working underneath working as the underpinnings of the mainstream to sort of like there is a responsibility there to create more sort of communal kind of coalitions with the work. Like I was explaining to this young woman here, of just like actually doing things at home and bringing people into your home. Just doing that and doing it local, keeping yourself sort of localized in that kind of activity. And, I really don't foresee any kind of weird future where we're all going to be living in sort of compartments of like self-blinders on with like Google Vision or whatever. Some people will, but, God bless them. I think you just... as long as you keep it real and just sort of, I mean, it's like we all still go to clubs and see music. That's not going to change, And as far as like sharing appreciation of records and television shows, and we, everybody knows about the same bands, at any given time. That's just not the way it is anymore. I mean, in a way, it's like it's kind of really amazing. It's like this utopian thing of like everything is available and the library has exploded. So I think it's going to become I think it's going to become a good thing, and I think all the fear and nihilism about like technology sort of eradicating our communities is a bunch of bunk.
There was an enthusiastic person right at the back who can ask the last question, I think.
Thanks. Thank you for allowing me to creep in there. You say the Sonic Youth's a live band. What's your favourite venue and why?
I guess, my favorite venue and why. To appease Dave, I should say the Hacienda, but I found the Hacienda to be very kind of brittly cold sometimes.
Yeah. Acoustic as shit.
Yeah, it was very, one of the worst sounding clubs I ever played. It's just to answer your question in the negative. There's been moments where we've played shows like on like outdoor festival stages, like late in the day when the sun is going down and it's just getting kind of purpley outside, and everything, all the amps are working and everything's on, and you've been on tour for like 2 months and you're just so well oiled, and you're out there and you can tell like this roiling audience is just like there with you, and like you're kind of doing exactly what you always wanted to do. That's probably my favorite thing.
Well, one of my favourite things is meeting people like Thurston Moore and hearing amazing stories, fantastic ideas, great questions as well. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Don't forget, of course, tomorrow John Cale is sitting here with John Doran. An embarrassment of riches at Sound City 14. Please put your hands together for Thurston Moore.